Good evening. Several of you are here for a second round, Gluttons for Punishment. And we certainly, on behalf of Mayor Montgomery and the Town Council, we invite you again. I see that we have maybe a third that are new and two-thirds perhaps that are back, but we welcome you here and to the Town of Jamestown Property Visioning Workshop. And we appreciate everyone that is investing their time, and we apologize a little bit for the delay as we got everything together. We wanted it to be completed and perfect. And the purpose of this public engagement process is to give our citizens an opportunity to shape the design and development of the 467 acres of property between Guilford Road and Mackey Road. And we have with us a little bit different approach than maybe others have taken and maybe we took last time, is we have Seth Harry and Associates. And Seth Harry is a planner, he is an architect, and he is an urban designer. And he has assembled his team to be here with us for this 5-day engagement. And his purpose is to be the advocate, hopefully, for our citizens and for our town council in helping to have the citizens to set the design for this particular property. And last night we went through certain preferences in terms of architectural style, road networks, groupings, and at the end, we did the dot exercise where people came up and put their dots on the thing that they thought was the best. And the good news about this particular process is all of the, I can assure you, all of the team were here all day, probably starting about 8:30 or 9 o'clock until just a minute. I can, other than the restrooms, we brought luncheon to them, and they were taking what was said and translating it into something that we are going to share with you tonight for some additional feedback. And we want to look out for, our purpose is to look out for the best interests of the town, of Jamestown, and for the citizens. And so again, those of you will be doing this for a second time, and some of you knew, but let's give a warm Jamestown welcome to Seth Harry and his team.
Thank you again, Dave. Okay. So welcome back for a second evening, and thank you all again very much for your time and attention to be here. We tried a new process. Thank you. We tried a new process yesterday, which was a hybrid event. And two things. One is, in spite of the best laid plans, it sort of kind of evolved even yesterday as we were in it, because the idea was to try to make the in-person and the online as close as possible, to make them as fair and equitable in terms of access and participation. And so we were going to do a short question and answer period at the end that we would then allow the online participants to also do in a similar format. And of course, not surprisingly, because this is the way these typically go in person, people start asking questions about what we're presenting to them. And one of the great things about this process is that everybody is in the room together. So everybody gets to hear the same questions, everybody gets to hear the same answers. And through that process, because you have that sort of shared dynamic, we end up kind of making a lot more progress very, very quickly, because we find out that a lot of people have the same questions. Some of them are answered reasonably well in one format and less so in others. But through the course of the evening, there's a better understanding of what it is we're trying to communicate as the basis for an informed conversation. And you have a little bit better understanding, hopefully, as to how this process works and how to make the most of it. So the big snafu yesterday was that we didn't have video feed, and we didn't realize it at the time. So even though we were trying to bring the online participants with us, that didn't happen until late today, so we got some of their input. We had the survey for them open, and I think it may still be open, in fact, and that's been sort of a little bit of a moving target. There were a couple of other snafus, which were mostly my fault. One is we had a questionnaire that we were going to hand out at the end of the evening, and some people had already left before we realized I neglected to mention that. So I think we got a pretty good representative sample anyway, but if anybody would like another shot at that questionnaire, they're more than welcome to. That was here last night. So Dave talked a little bit about last night's process for the benefit of the people who weren't here last night. We put up a couple of we tried to take a fairly complicated introductory PowerPoint and turn it into a series of simple sort of issue-based questions. And the idea was to break them down into component pieces so that we could get a pretty accurate sense of where the community sentiment lay with respect to those issues. This is really driven by the online survey. And when we went to try to correlate the two, in part because of the problems that we had yesterday, it turned out to be a very lengthy and complicated process, which you're going to see the results of which in a minute. The other thing that was going on was that we were sort of fielding questions both sort of during the process last night and to a certain extent afterwards while we were doing the DOT exercise. And obviously the people who, and these were informal questions because the team was here specifically to answer those questions if there were any. And the problem is that, again, how do we communicate those questions and those answers to people who weren't in the room last night? So there's a couple in particular that I'd like to sort of talk about this evening, that questions that I was asked, and so that everybody would have the benefit of hearing those. And then lastly, we did the first round of plans, and because I was kind of preoccupied with sorting through the survey results, the plans developed a fair bit before I had a chance to kind of peek over their shoulder and kind of have a look at what they were doing. And some of the feedback we were getting from the online, and just in general, because we encouraged the online participants to email town staff if they had specific questions and comments. I realized that when we put up some of the examples of the center, general, and edge condition of a neighborhood structure, that we didn't have enough bandwidth in there in terms of the range of lot sizes and unit types that we had intended to have, or at least I had hoped to have. And so we kind of heard back that there was concern that this was, essentially similar to the previous submittal, but just in a nicer looking package. That's really not true. I feel very confident that the new traditional neighborhood format is quite distinct, and it's actually in the 2007 comp plan. The language for it is in there, very similar to a lot of the things that we talked about. So it didn't really just come out of thin air, but we also, I think one of the questions was, well, if the community says, well, just all we want is single-family detached houses on large lots, would you draw it? And the short answer is, if the entire community wanted that, and they understood the implications of that, we would draw it, absolutely, because that's what we're here to do. But if we were to do that, that has both legal and economic implications for the town and the residents as a whole. So we want to make sure that while we're going through this process, that first of all, everybody's heard, and secondly, that everybody that has an opportunity to understand some of the implications of that. And then this is the technique and the strategy that we use to try to confirm that everybody who has a say, has an opportunity to be heard, and that those voices are documented appropriately. So, you did a pretty good job talking about yesterday's presentation. Is there anything else you think I probably need to touch on for the new? Okay, perfect. Okay, so I made some notes this morning to remind myself of some of the questions that were asked. Well, first of all, we have the full team here this evening, so I want to introduce two new in-person members. One is Keith Covington. Keith is an architect and planner, formerly worked for Metro Nashville as a planner in-house. And two of the example projects we talked about last night, and I picked them specifically because we had familiarity with them in the team, was Carothers Crossing and West Haven, just outside of Nashville. Keith lives in Nashville. He's very familiar with both of those projects, in part because he administered them for Metro Nashville as an in-house staff planner, but he also lived in both of them. So if you have any questions at all about either of those projects, Keith would be happy to fill you in on any particular aspect of it because he's intimately familiar with both of them. And, thank you. And Stephen Fett. And Stephen also is an architecture professor at the University of Miami, and he had a class last night. So he was actually here, but he was doing his class remotely from the hotel. So, and then we also have two we have two remote other team members. One is Tony Cease, a local civil engineer who lives in Durham. In fact, he lives in a walkable pre-war neighborhood, very similar to the ones we talked about last night. And Peter Roper, who's an architect and renderer whose work you'll be seeing later on in the charrette. So we started and there was a question last night that a gentleman asked me a couple of times, and I wanted to give an answer to that because I'm not sure I've understood his question at the time. He was asking about the overall number of housing units in some of the example projects that we were referencing yesterday. And as I said, the principles are not density specific or yield specific. You can ratchet them up or ratchet them down. Usually the biggest single factor in both the cost of the houses and the size of the lots and the houses themselves is the market. A lot of these projects are in very, very dynamic real estate markets. Kentlands, for instance, is in Montgomery County, which is not only one of the most affluent markets in the greater Washington, D.C. metro area, but actually also in the country as a whole. So obviously, they're operating in a different market environment. One of the reasons why I specifically included West Haven and Carothers is because the projects are very similar from a physical planning and design point of view, but the price points are actually quite different, and that has to do with where they are in the greater Nashville metro area. So when we start talking about taking these principles and planning principles and applying them in a local market like Jamestown, we have to calibrate for that. And at this point, we don't really know exactly where that is, but we have the ability to adjust. And we have the ability to adjust both on the basis of community input and also on the basis of the property owner's own financial objectives. So there is flexibility there. And I think we missed last night, again, on that bandwidth. So I've got a slide in here tonight to talk a little bit about what we intended to show yesterday and what we think is probably more consistent with what the community's preferences are. So let me just go through my notes here one more time. Oh, so Kentlands, by the way. The number on Kentlands is 352 acres, and it's about 1,600 units, which works out to a gross density of a little over 4 units per acre, which is about a quarter acre lot. So that's the average density for the entire project, including parks, lakes, commercial areas, everything. So actually for that market, that's a very modest density for a lot of the newer developments that's been happening there. Our project, Carothers Crossing, on the other hand, looks very much like the plan that you saw last night, which had a lot of open space. We actually restored a lot of the natural meadows there. And so even though the developed parts of the plan look very similar to West Haven, it was actually built at a much more modest overall density. So there is a lot of flexibility here. And one of the reasons now why we're drawing these plans is so that we can get your input and feedback and make those adjustments as needed to make sure that we're not only taking the market into account, but that we're taking the community preference into account as well. Okay. So what we're doing tonight, I think, because we did actually put together a questionnaire for tonight, which we'll have online, but I think I'm going to go more with a typical in-person approach here, because we're trying to really take maximum advantage of everybody's input, and we'll try to give the online participants an opportunity to do so as well. Okay, so let's get started. So these are basically the, and when this, by the way, this is what we normally do. We usually talk about what we heard last time so that we can, it's almost like reading the minutes from the previous meeting. So these were the, oh, thank you, Anna. We took the boards and basically broke them down into separate images. And this is the actual percentage breakdown from yesterday on the issue-based questions asked. So for neighborhood structure, it was about an 89% to 11% preference for a neighborhood with a mix of house types, price points. Then in terms of connectivity, it was about a 91% preference for connectivity network, fine-grained networks, 8% preference for coarse-grained, larger road. And in the lower percentages are the online respondents. And again, they were at a disadvantage because they really didn't get an opportunity to engage with the original presentation as intended. And so this might change, and now that we've had an opportunity to get that online. For public open space, and again, you can just at a glance, you can sort of kind of see where the breakdown is in terms of preference within the community or within the last night's audience. 6% preference for large recreational fields, single large recreational field, 20% preference for small neighborhood parks, and a 74% preference for a combination of the two. And again, these are not unusual. These are pretty consistent with what we find in most of the communities that we work in. Street design, 98% preference for walkable, slow speed, pedestrian-friendly streets, and an 8% preference for auto-oriented streets, and that includes all of the details that you see in there, the wide streets, the lack of sidewalks, lack of street trees, et cetera. For vehicle access, and this was interesting, so again, we have no idea what we're going to get when we put this out here. Not surprisingly, actually, we got a 3% preference for front-loaded housing, houses where you park, the garage faces the street and you park in front. A pretty robust preference for rear-loaded, which we were a little bit surprised about, but also a very strong preference for a combination of the two. The idea that the size of the lot and the location within the neighborhood would influence where it would be appropriate to do rear-loaded houses and front-loaded houses. And again, when we revisit this whole idea, the center general edge condition recalibrated for Jamestown, I think you'll see we have some examples of that here. Strong preference for a mix of house types and price points within each neighborhood, 97% to 3%, not so much preference for the single-use, single-type, single-price point pods. And by the way, that diagram was in there not necessarily because that's what we're advocating for, but because we felt that there had to be an option that was different enough, obviously, from the T&D type of development that the 2007 comp plan actually specifically called for on this property. We could do, as I said, nothing but, half-acre single-family detached houses on the site if the community really said that's what they want us to draw. But those were the two that we thought was most representative of where the comp plan, from a policy point of view, was starting the conversation. Then architecture, strong preference for traditional architecture, zero preference for modern, very low preference for quote-unquote builder contemporary, and a reasonable preference for a mix of styles. And when we say mix of styles, that can be interpreted in a couple of different ways. In this particular image, the mix was between a modern style and a traditional style, but it could be a mix between a Victorian, a classic colonial revival or something like that. So you can do traditional mix of styles as well. There was interest, this idea of the mansion flat. We've got a couple of variations in it in the plans that we're developing right now. This is what we call a mansion flat because it looks like a large single-family detached house, but it's actually a multi-unit condo. And again, very popular with retirees. They typically actually have an elevator in them as well. I think zero preference for larger apartment buildings and zero preference for accommodation. So this is basically telling us that smaller apartment buildings set within a walkable neighborhood context is something that the community thinks would be of value. Senior housing, not surprisingly, we're all getting older, and if we're not older, we have certainly older parents. There was a relatively low support for the idea of sort of creating a enclave, if you will, of older people, a age-restricted enclave. A pretty strong preference for senior housing integrated into the neighborhood context. A pretty strong preference for senior housing integrated in neighborhood context in a variety of different formats. And again, we have pictures in the original PowerPoint, which I believe is online, if people want to see the images that we used in last night's presentation to represent that. Assisted living, not much interest in a separate assisted living, quote unquote, campus or facility. A fair amount of support for the idea of having assisted living integrated in the community, preferably near the community's commercial area with daily needs, goods and services, but also a pretty strong preference for no assisted living at all. So this is an area, by the way, when we see this, we see, kind of a mix between the two, we will typically show both of those in our detailed plans so that we bring more resolution to this idea so we can get additional feedback and clarity on and we might, this may end up not getting resolved. But the fact is that there's strong preferences both for and for not having assisted living within the project, within the property. Retail mixed use area. The takeaway here was that this was interesting, and we had some anomalies in the online survey just in terms of how the information was presented, so we're going to go back through this again just to confirm that what we're representing here is accurate, and if it isn't, we'll update that on the website. But this is one of the ones where we got quite a big difference between the in-person and the remote, and I'm not quite sure what that is because they've tracked pretty closely for the most part otherwise. And there was on the online strong sentiment against any commercial at all. On the in-person, pretty good support, for something, and the location of which is still yet to be resolved. And we were drawing, furiously all day long. We put some commercial in there somewhere. And again, one of the things we're going to be doing later this evening is asking you to tell us, again, if you like that use in this plan, and do you like it where it is? And if not, we'll look at other options for it. Format of retail mixed-use center, again, walkable, more traditional neighborhood setting, and no shopping centers. And then the last question was, in the in-person survey, the scale of the retail. And there was strong support for really just basically a neighborhood serving community scale. And I will say, by the way, because that was one of the questions I was asked about during the DOT exercise, we work with a lot of Main Street communities. That's one of our sort of specialties. We do, like for instance, we did a market retail analysis and positioning strategy for Beaufort, South Carolina. Beaufort is probably one of the has had more movies filmed there than any place outside of Hollywood. And it's got a beautiful downtown. And they were trying to struggle with how to kind of get the right balance between their downtown, the retailers in the downtown historic district and the suburban corridors leading into the town. But they're also kind of nestled between two major regional destinations, Savannah and Charleston. So there's some advantages to having a variety of different retail in a town like Beaufort, because a lot of the residents are leaving Beaufort to shop in either the major suburban corridors to the south or going to Charleston or Savannah. So how they position themselves within that market context is important. It's important to the downtown retailers and it's important to the community as a whole. So there's sometimes advantages to having additional retail because it changes the retail dynamics in the region. And again, this is one of the questions that we can help provide some clarity on in terms of what you would like to see. Right now, we recognize, by the way, your downtown is incredibly charming. I love it. But it offers a relatively limited range of merchandise, which means that there's a lot of consumer dollars leaving Jamestown and being spent elsewhere. So then again, the question is that you absolutely want to protect that retail that you have in the downtown, but do you want to also look for opportunities to either serve the growing consumer demand within the community and or change your market positioning in the regional marketplace as a whole? And we've done that. We've done that in communities all over the place. Here, we're not doing that, but it is a question that, as a community, as residents of Jamestown, you might want to consider as part of this process. And there was still, again, support for no retail, which we're okay with, by the way. I just want to let you know what your options are there. So in addition to the DOT exercise, excuse me, we asked the question, what would you most like to see and what would you least like to see? And I just put the top 5 up there, but I have the actual list here. And it was pretty diffuse. I mean, the top 5 and most like to see at the top of the list was park, recreation, and green space, which again is a pretty common request in all of our plans, excuse me. And there was a pretty long list. So no single preference, really dominated from a percentage point of view. Next up was the school, which was discussed quite a bit last night. And we recognized that if it were to be a public school, it would probably not meet the warrants for a need, but we could certainly preserve a site or ask to preserve a site as part of the plan, either for a private school or a charter school and or some civic amenity, or preserve that site for a future school when the opportunity presents itself. But the desire for it has been noted. Trees and buffer, you would like to see that retained. We tried to reflect that in the first pass of the plan. A variety of housing types, 6%, small community-oriented retail, 6%, and then from there, 5% or lower was walkable, bikeable, single-family homes, variety of housing prices, quality housing, side entry, 2-car garage, no competition with Main Street, which we already talked a little bit about, property values, roadside appeal, brickstone, maintained feel, history of Jamestown, mixed use, high-end housing, low density, mixed generational community. All of those were, in terms of importance or mention on the surveys, were 5 percentage points or less. So it's a pretty, I wouldn't say it's all over the map. There is some consistency there. But when you get into sort of smaller percentage items, most of them are consistent, again, with the things that we talked about last night. Things you would not like to see or do not want to see. Cookie cutter was the highest one. Survey said, as the game show likes to say. Low quality, no trees, apartments, large retail, commercial. Again, pretty consistent with what the dot exercises showed. And again, one of the reasons why we go through this type, this gives us something we can actually do online in a fairly precise way, but this just supports. By the way, at this point, I think the online comments we got were pretty consistent with this as well. And then the rest of those were, once we got below the top 5, high density, impervious surfaces, only high priced, rentals, retirement community, unkept houses and yards, vinyl and cheap materials, a new Main Street, quote unquote, all low price, bars, cars on the street, lack of diverse homes, large multi-unit apartments, lots of commercial, missing sidewalks, neighborhood pods, no major roads, recreational center, retail center, commercial, no separate community, small lots, street-facing garages, strip center, retail, unclear. Most of this, most communities would say they would prefer not to have. So, and again, pretty consistent with what we talked about in the principles of neighborhood-based development that is, again, in the 2007 comp plan as a policy objective. Okay, so moving on. This is an example of one of our other projects in the deliverables. This is where we hope to get to by Saturday. I'm just going to warn you right now, we're not there yet. We spent a lot of time dealing with the complexity of this sort of hybrid process, but we will get it worked out. And we promised to do a pinup tonight. We're doing a pinup tonight. And to let you know that we have been here and we are working, and we have tried to translate what we think we heard into something that you can respond to and tell us what we got right, what we got wrong. But there's a couple things I just want to mention on this. This plan actually has a lot of the features that you that you expressed your preferences for. We may or may not get to a plan exactly like that, but it's not significantly different than what we are going to try to, I should say the principles that inform this plan are the same principles that we talked about for designing this property. So there's other factors that may dictate and control how close it gets to this, but it tries to preserve open space, it tries to respect the character of the land, the character of the community in which it's located. That we went through a very similar public process to design this. And so yours will look different when it's finished, but there's a lot of similarities there once you get beyond those preferences based on that community's input. Oh, by the way, this is just to remind me to talk about the comp plan. This is the town of Jamestown, October 2000. I think this was recently, or is about to be updated, is that correct, with essentially confirming this. So this is the future, basically the growth strategy map, the future land use map, and it actually specifically mentions the Johnson property, and it also specifically mentions essentially new traditional neighborhood development in language very, very similar to what we talked about last night. So it is consistent with that. And this is an opportunity, if that's not what you'd like to see, although this recommendation went through a very similar public vetting process. But if that's not what you'd like to see, again, this is another opportunity to potentially challenge that. So assuming that we're still more or less tracking and consistent with the general preferences expressed by the community as a whole, and I think the dot exercises supports that for the most part. You know, we missed on a couple of things, I think, clearly, but for the most part, I think it's more a matter of degree than I think whether or not it's specifically inconsistent with any of those things, any of those goals and objectives. Just a quick reminder, neighborhood-based, walkable, connected, provides housing choice, range of house types and price points, and mixed use. And as we just went through review of the dot exercise and the comments, I think these are all consistent. I don't see any inconsistencies here. Good question. The question was, what's mixed use? Mixed use is when you have two different uses in close proximity to each other, either horizontally or vertically, in a format that allows you to easily access both of those uses. So that could be an office building with ground floor retail. It could be an apartment building with ground floor retail. It could be an office building and on ground floor commercial and upstairs residential. But they can be vertical, but they can also be mixed use. A lot of older commercial areas were mixed use, not because they were vertically mixed use, but because you could directly access those uses. Like streetcar suburbs typically had small scale, single-story commercial, but they were literally on the end grains of neighborhood blocks. So you could walk straight from your house right to the store, literally feet away. Yeah. Well, I would describe your downtown district as mixed use. Because we literally could walk out of here and have lunch 2 minutes away. That is mixed use, but it's mixed use at a scale that is appropriate for a small town or village. Well, okay, well, thank you. You're one voice. We went through a whole exercise last night where we showed examples of something that looks very much like your downtown, and it got a lot of support.
You gave us choices there, but your online people also voice opinions.
They did, but they did not have the opportunity that the in-person participants had to understand the nuance of mixed use covers such an incredibly wide range of building types, styles, market dynamics, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the reasons why we're going through this exercise is so that when somebody says mixed use, one person isn't thinking Manhattan and another person thinking something in the Cotswolds. They're all mixed use, but mixed use comes in a variety of different sizes for a variety of different market contexts and for a variety of different community contexts. The only thing we're only doing here is to put it on the table for discussion by all of the residents. And then we take the sentiment of the room based on these kinds of surveys, and then we say there's general support for this, or there's generally no support for this. And that means there'll be some people who like it and some who won't. But if we don't understand what we mean by that, then there's no way we can come to a resolution on it one way or the other. I appreciate that. Thank you. So again, neighborhood center, that might be where that small scale mixed use might happen or not. It's not for me to decide. Neighborhood general is where the bulk of the housing product types reside and the biggest diversity of housing types in terms of size and price points. And then neighborhood edge, like that image I showed earlier, can be actually fairly low density, fairly large lot houses that sound very much like what many of the people in the community have expressed an interest in seeing. The question is do you want to see that in a neighborhood context as part of a mix of a variety of different house types and price points, or do you want the entire 500 acres to look like that? And that's sort of the question on the table right now. And again, that's not for us to decide, that's for us to put out there for consideration. Sorry, excuse me. I thought I turned this off. My apologies, I thought I turned this off. Anyway, sorry. So moving on. The reason why, by the way, this is a good time maybe to revisit this. The reason why we do multiple pinups is because we don't anticipate that the first thing we draw is that everybody's going to fall in love with it. And we also don't assume that just because we do a survey like we did last night, that we're going to hear from everybody and that everybody's going to agree. But we keep doing this because every time we do it, we learn something new, we all learn something new, and we get better at the job of discussing this in a more productive and accurate way. So this is why we're sort of kind of going through this process. Today was a little bit rough, I have to say, and we didn't get everything right last night, but I want to talk a little bit about what I think we didn't get right, so that when we do this again tomorrow night, we'll be even closer again. So Neighborhood Edge, this actually was the Kentlands. Those are big houses, but they're not on big lots. And I'm not a big fan of big houses on big lots personally, but I think, again, we need to find the right balance and the right mix for this community, and we're looking for your help and assistance in doing that. So we were trying to do a couple of things here today, not all of which we got done, but one of the things was to begin to talk about how we design these communities collectively in a more systematic way. And really looking at the neighborhood center general and edge condition is critical because we want to show you the flexibility of these different mixes of house types, which again can be expressed, the preferences for which can be expressed by the community, but we can also discuss it in terms of market demand and economic implications. You can also, because we do this, you can say, this is going to be how many units we're going to allow to be built there, and then let the market kind of dictate the nature and shape of those units, as long as they don't go over that overall unit count cap agreement. You can also set percentages, no more than so many percent of this type of house, no more than so many percent of that type of house, and all of these things can go into the development agreement. And then the builder developer is obliged to respect those numbers, and they're all subject to negotiation. So the question is, again, from your point of view as residents here, what would you like to see? What do you think is in the best collective interest of the town, taking all of these different factors into consideration? But we're going to try to illustrate that so you can see the implications of these different sort of potential build-out scenarios. So you can tell us, we like this, we don't like that, and so forth. It's just a lot to get done in 5 days, and we're still only on day one. So this is what I think we got wrong yesterday. And when we talked about that neighborhood edge, and we heard a lot about, this isn't Jamestown, or, we're being, sort of forced to pick a T&D, for instance. We talked about the attributes of T&D in part because we do happen to believe that that's a smart way to build a community, and that most of the communities that most people like in most places actually have a lot of those attributes. It's kind of a question of how much of what versus whether or not those principles are largely embraced. And I think the exercise we went through, I think, did a pretty good job of showing that. What we didn't show here, we showed a lot of sort of neighborhood edge general conditions, but when we got to the neighborhood edge, this really didn't look like Jamestown. And when we got that feedback online, I went over and I looked at all the images and the examples that we used to talk about these ideas. And I said, they're right. That doesn't look like Jamestown. And that really wasn't our intention. So we took a few minutes off from our very busy and hectic and challenging day, and we got some pictures of some houses that look like Jamestown. You know how long it took us to get these? About 2 minutes. You know where these pictures were taken? Right down the street. This is, in fact, everything we're talking about right here for the edge conditions. The garages are set back from the street. They're either rear or side loaded. All of this can go into a T&D. In fact, we want this in the T&D. This is the kind of edge condition that says you're in Jamestown, and it also says that there is market demand for this kind of product here in Jamestown, but there's also potentially market demand for other things here in Jamestown, all of which taken together can make a great place. And we talked about how the design of the neighborhood itself can impact the value of the housing. And this, we can do exactly the same thing in Jamestown. So we didn't get it exactly right yesterday, but today is today. So we have an opportunity to put this back in front of you and ask you, is this what you meant when you said it doesn't look, this is what looks like Jamestown? And you can go ahead and say yes or raise your hand or whatever. So we're going to ask the same question to people online. But we get this. I think we got it yesterday. We just didn't put it up there. But this was an opportunity to come back and say, look, we got one thing wrong, and this is one of the things we got wrong. We certainly got, well, we got more than one thing wrong, but this is one of the things I think we got wrong. So when we plan these plans, when we say neighborhood edge, this is what we're talking about right here. Okay. No, these are all attached. These are all every single one of these houses is front loaded. The only thing that there's two things they don't have. They don't have a garage facing the street. That's one important thing, although there are a couple over there that do. But the other thing, it's a wide lot. It's a lot that can support this. The houses are set further back, and they back to nature, which, by the way, is exactly a condition that we have on this property. So it's not that we didn't understand that this was an option. We just neglected to put it into the mix when we started. Because, as I said, this was a little bit of a complicated process for us. We've never done a hybrid process before. What I've learned is it's like doing two workshops simultaneously. And this was already a tough enough assignment to do once. But again, we think we're making progress in terms of what we understand that you're looking for, and we're trying to incorporate that into the plans that we're creating for you. So, and again, this is the edge condition version of that general condition model that we showed before, and you can see the front load of the house, the garages are set back, or their side load, or whatever. When we get to doing those renderings that you saw earlier in the slide, in the PowerPoint, you're going to see renderings of this for your town. But that might take until at least tomorrow. But I'm only half kidding. It's a work in progress. That's the reason why it's called, a process and not a fait accompli. Okay, now, that's right. That's behind the boards there. We're going to look at the plans, and there's some things here to talk about. These were three designers working independently of each other, sort of doing one of them doing sort of their version of what they think they heard and what they think they saw based on the boards. I was busy trying to figure out how to turn those into comparable surveys. There's some things here that I think sort of speak to what we've been talking about the last 2 days, and there are some things here that I don't think really do a good job of it. But I'm going to go ahead and walk you through what the thinking was, and then we're going to ask you which ones you like. We're going to pin them up, and I guess we can either just put dots on, well, not dots. How are we going to do it again? What's the plan? Okay. Anyway, so we're going to say which plan do you like best, first of all, and then we're going to try to ask or get feedback on what you like about each plan. Because what we end up doing is the reason why we're going to have 3 plans is because based on that feedback, we will start to consolidate plans, taking the best features of each one based on the input that we have from the community. So there's a number of things we're kind of struggling with. The thing you can see, obviously, and I'm going to try to use the laser pointer, even though I apologize to the people at home, we're going to talk about. So this looks like the diagram. It should have been turned 90 degrees, but we were rushing, obviously, to match the diagrams you saw last night. But again, this is Guilford College Road. Oops, sorry, hit the wrong button. Sorry, guys. It's been a long day. Can I get back from there? I exit. Of course. You can't get, I think that was a line in, we needed to call in the, I thought I was hitting the laser pointer light. Were we doing this off of the jump drive, or was it? Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, great, thank you very much. Sorry about that. I'll try to push the correct button next time. Okay, so this is Guilford College. North is that way, I believe. So the community college down here. This is Guilford Road. This is Guilford Road. Tomorrow night we'll have all of the plans oriented the same way. And you can sort of see that diagram we started with yesterday, which was where we blocked out all of the parts of the plan where we will not build for all the reasons we talked about. Stream buffers, creek crossings, steep slopes, et cetera. This is a small neighborhood scale retail commercial center. That's going to be a subject of discussion probably through the whole week, but it's much smaller than what we saw diagrammatically last night. And again, it can move probably but this seems to be the frontage that it wants to be at, because again, it's facing basically a utility easement, and it has exposure to the traffic along here. This is sort of this is basically a pocket neighborhood unto itself, because it doesn't really attach to anything, although there is a potential connection through there if needed. One of the things we were trying to do here, there's a large, there's a fairly large wooded area right there. And when we have those and we're trying to decide between what trees to save and what trees need to be sacrificed in the name of quote unquote progress, we try to provide a nice neighborhood in lieu of those. And a lot of times we'll go in and we'll actually document the specimen trees within the site and incorporate those trees. In fact, the Kentlands did that on one of the first projects of this nature, and there was a beautiful huge tree that they actually made a little pocket park around. When you get to that level of detail, you can actually do that. And again, the flexibility of the plan gives you the opportunity to do that. And we would normally, if we were taking this all the way through, we would actually design at that level of detail. This is really more of a diagram, but it tries to capture the essence of the site and its potential. So this is this is a neighborhood, not a pod, and it links through and connects up with other neighborhoods. So you're taking really a fairly disparate network of buildable parcels of land and trying to turn it into a community, really, and a community of 3 neighborhoods. So this is almost a more detailed physical manifestation of the diagram you saw last night, talking about, again, connecting the dots in terms of not only access, but connecting the dots internally in terms of neighborhoods. And so at the center of each neighborhood is that neighborhood green, that neighborhood park, or maybe several, and they vary in size and scale. So one of these might be a future, and you could take this whole pod right here, for instance, I shouldn't say pod, this block, and that could be a school site. So unlike suburbia where it's like, here's a school site, it's here or nowhere, for forevermore, this type of planning, community planning, neighborhood formatted planning has a tremendous amount of flexibility. And again, most importantly, this is still a diagram. All it is a diagram of all those ideas we talked about last night in graphic form. And the value of it is that it shows how those principles can be applied to a specific piece of land. But you could do 100 different variations on this, and they would still respond to exactly the same principles, same preferences, same ideas we talked about last night. We don't have time to do that many, and we don't really think we need to, because we're trying to work towards the best possible plan based on the input that we get from you. But, when it gets skinny, it gets skinny. Where it gets bigger, you have those small-scale, fine-grained street networks so that you can live here and go visit your neighbor over there on your bicycle or on foot without having to leave your pod and go into another pod, et cetera, et cetera. You can also circulate within the neighborhoods very easily without having to get out onto the collector roads. But we've also done things like this. Because we had an existing wooded area here, we kept that there as a frontage, basically a frontage condition. We looked at every single development along the street. Not a single house, residence, or was, I think, a dentist office that actually faced the street. Everything else either turned its back to it or turned its side to it. So we said, well, we could do that too, but we could also provide an amenity for the community as a whole. So that's what we did. But we also saved some of those trees to make a neighborhood park here so that not only are the trees being respected and still, but they're being used in a way that adds value to the community as a whole. They're not just trees, a stand of trees, out in the middle of nowhere. They're adding value to every single home in that neighborhood. The other thing that's nice is, you could potentially bias some of these neighborhoods towards, for instance, maybe more senior living or different stage of life, young marrieds or whatever. But you have a range. You can certainly get a range of product types and price points within each of these. And it's not hard to imagine that, and also everybody feeling like they belong to the same community. That's exactly how they live. In fact, Keith and I were talking about that today. West Haven, you said, is probably the most valuable piece of real estate in all of Metro Nashville. And he said the thing that makes it so valuable, in part, is because everybody feels like they're part of the community. And you guys should talk to Keith. So that's the first plan. Yes. Sure. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'd be happy to, and I apologize for that. Well, again, remember, density is a relative thing. So we had 3 people working. Everybody was sort of working at different levels of coming to terms with the site. And one of the reasons why we use three designers, and sometimes more, is that everybody approaches it a little bit differently. And what normally happens is that one single plan is not typically the clear winner, but the community will see bits and pieces of each plan. It's a little bit like the Chinese menu approach. You take the best parts of each one and then you kind of combine them together. This is pretty coherent for a first day. Again, remember, we started drawing. We didn't just start drawing this morning. We started designing it this morning. So this one, not quite so far developed, but that's the nature of this. When you start, you don't know where you're going to end up. But getting back to your question, colors. The colors represent center, general, and edge. So they go back to that diagram you saw last night. They each have a different character. They each have a little bit of a different bias in terms of relative densities. But all of that can be ramped up and all of it can be toned down. And I can show you examples of both in every pre-war neighborhood out there. So don't fixate on the densities in overall terms. Just remember, these are, well, this one is not really diagrammatically very strong because generally speaking, the center should be in the center. And here, things got a little bit disconnected. Okay. Yellow is the general neighborhood condition. Orange is supposed to be the neighborhood center condition, and the light yellow is supposed to be the neighborhood edge condition. I hesitated to put this up because it really isn't developed enough to talk to. But getting back to your question, these are the same. This is an easier diagram to understand that. This is the neighborhood center, so it has the higher density house types. That could be townhouses, but it could also be narrow lot, single family homes. Yep.
Sorry to interrupt, but the darkest color is the center, and the orange is more the general.
Oh.
The yellow is the edge.
Okay, then so everybody interpreted it a little bit differently. But I would interpret it actually probably as the center and the edge. But the point is, it's a hierarchy of relative densities and unit types, building types based on those relative densities. But we could make that whatever the community would like it to be, but the idea again is there's a neighborhood center, a neighborhood general, and a neighborhood edge condition. And we can decide collectively what that means in terms of density. Right now, it's a diagram showing those principles applied to this piece of land. And there's a lot more conversation to have, But now we can have a conversation about an actual plan on an actual piece of ground. So that's the point for that. But anyway, I'm sorry for the confusion. And this is probably more confusing than it is illuminating, so I'm going to move to this one. This one's a little bit better as a direct comparison with the first scheme. It's oriented the same way again, but you're seeing the same notion again of, sort of neighborhood structure, neighborhood general, neighborhood edge. In this particular case, again, some kind of neighborhood serving amenity, whether that's retail, whether it's a day school, whatever it might be. But you're seeing that same sort of structure, again, laid out, and you're seeing, obviously, the places that are not only not developable, but could be basically what we would call like a contiguous linear park or an emerald necklace. So we could put walking paths in there. We're obviously preserving the natural habitat in there and so forth, but it's the shape and nature of the neighborhoods are being informed by the topography and features of the site itself. These need to be developed, and they will be developed, and to a large extent, we're going to struggle a little bit even to ask specific questions of you about what you like or don't like about these particular plans based on what we have here to show you. So I'm not even really sure whether or not we should actually engage in that exercise right now. And we will be meeting again tomorrow night where we can develop these a little bit more. But you can tell us, certainly, I like this plan better than that plan, and probably to a certain extent describe why. Okay, now a couple more things. Again, this is another variation on this idea of trying to preserve that sort of vegetated edge there. And this gentleman was drawing this plan, and I said, I like that. I like your plan, but I think he has a better idea. So literally at 4 o'clock this afternoon, that part of his plan changed. So we did a little internal pinup, if you will, and we decided on behalf of the community that we thought that did a better job of representing what we heard last night. Now again, we may have gotten it wrong, but at least now it's up there, and you can tell us whether you like that idea or not. There's some other things going on here too. One of the things we've been trying to just figure out is how to handle that frontage condition. We actually measured, if you look over here at that utility easement, that's a Colonial gas easement, which, by the way, that same exact pipeline goes about a quarter mile from my house up in Maryland. Same pipeline. Should tell you something about infrastructure. But it actually has 100 and, what's the?
150 between the edge of the easement and
the right-of-way of Guilford College Road. So I think we talked a little bit last night about like to like, meaning that the way we try to design the communities is that when you look out your front window, you see something that looks like what you live in. And I actually skipped over that a little bit on those neighborhood diagrams, which I can go back to. But so this is a like-to-like condition. It's vegetated right now over here because the utility left a 100-foot deep vegetated buffer. And if you drive down that road right now, it looks like you're driving through the countryside. So one option is to say, well, that's a 4-lane suburban arterial. That's an opportunity for a shopping center or whatever. And shopping centers are not all bad. They generate a nice little tax revenue, and they provide, goods and services that probably a lot of residents of Jamestown are leaving Jamestown to secure in other communities elsewhere. But this is also a legitimate response. So again, this is a question. This is one way to handle that frontage condition. Another way is to commercialize it. We've also talked about other options for this. One is again, putting that as small-scale apartment types along that edge as almost like a hard edge. There's a number of projects that we're familiar with where they literally built a permanent wall on that, engaged the apartment buildings in the wall, and then made a very nice boulevard section out of that. This is natural enough that we think that the natural buffer is a legitimate option, but there are other ways to do that. When we get further into this, we will try to give you examples of different treatments for that frontage condition, so you can tell us we like this, we don't like that, or whatever, but also just to let you know that there's a dozen different ways that frontage could be designed in detail. It doesn't have to be all this or all that. And we want you to have the knowledge of what some of those options look like. I'm going to go back real quick since we talked about, okay. So this is now getting out into the neighborhood edge condition. So you can see the houses start to get bigger, the lots start to get bigger. At some point, we start to transition from alley loaded, back or rear loaded, if you will, blocks here in the more general condition to a front loaded condition here. By the time you're out here, you could even potentially do a circular driveway or something like that. But the point is, generally speaking, when you look out your front door, you see something that looks like the house you live in. And so this is where we talk about, we're starting to show some platting. This is where we talk about, we make those transitions at the mid-block. So it's not, even if there's a little bit of a transition here in lot size and house size, it's within an acceptable range so that it's not a jarring juxtaposition. And as we continue to develop these plans, well, that is the way I want to go, sorry. As we continue to develop these plans in more detail, we will be doing detailed plans of some of these areas to show exactly how that would be done in these individual neighborhoods. There's only so much we can get done in a 4-day process on a property this size, but what we want to do is cover all the bases so that every single important detail that you need to know about and to weigh in on, we've given you an opportunity to both understand and express an opinion on. And tomorrow we'll do a better job. But we're sort of laying the foundation for that with this. So I think for tonight, as I'm about ready to wrap up here, we're going to put these up. We're going to give everybody an opportunity to just weigh in general, which of these plans you think better represents what you would like to see on that property and what you think best represents the character and uniqueness of Jamestown. And we may ask you if there's something specific that we've discussed this evening that you really like about it, the vegetated edge or what have you, let us know, and then we will incorporate that into the final plan and maybe take some of those other ideas and work those in as well too. And then also tell us again if there's anything here that you specifically don't like. Yes? Yeah. And I apologize for that. That was an unfortunate glitch. This is another reason why we do, a 4 or 5 day long process. Not only because not everybody can attend every single night, but also because not every single night goes according to plan. We were trying something new and different that's never been tried before, at least as far as we're aware of. And it was interesting because the problem that we had was video cable, was it? Oh, it was the computer. So as I always like to say, technology only fails when you absolutely positively need it to work. So, and we were trying something new and it didn't work. Oh, well, yes, thank you. Right. Right.
And has been for decades.
Right.
We live very close to the airport. The quality of our air requires us to have a kind of reverence for nature that will actually benefit us. So, I'm looking at this, at most of the people here have gray hair. But if we're thinking down the line here for the millennials, the Gen Xers, and so on, they're going to be thinking about those things they already are.
Right.
And so
Well, some of us have been thinking about those things from the 70s. So just so you know, and I was around in the 70s when Earth Day was initially inaugurated. We got a little lost on the way. I will say this. Well, there are two ways. One is people have to live somewhere. And if not here, they will live somewhere else. And if not like this, they will live in some other way. I have presentations that I give all the time. The project we're doing in Southern Maryland is in a critical watershed area for Chesapeake Bay, which is one of the most endangered estuaries in this country. And so water quality is at the top of their list for everything that we do. The North Carolina Coastal Commission, did you see that one? Remember? They did a study. They modeled the runoff from a conventional suburban development, very similar to what there is a lot of around here, and a compact. And by the way, compact was one of the things, cluster development, which is in the 2007 comp plan specifically regarding this type of development. They looked at impervious surfaces, they looked at the volume of runoff, they looked at the water, the quality of that runoff, and they showed, I think neither one was the equivalent of an undisturbed natural landscape. But this version of development versus a conventional development, and I can get that and put it up here tomorrow night if you'd like to see it. But they did an actual statistical analysis in this form of development. The quality of the water, the volume and the quality of the water was like a 90% difference between the conventional suburban model and that. So one of the reasons I didn't mention sustainability is because it is an integral part of everything we typically do in design, by definition, by the nature of the way these projects are developed. But it's always in the context of either this or what otherwise might be built if you didn't say this is what we want. So, and in a lot of places, communities either don't take the time or don't have the ability to say that, so the other thing gets built. And as you know, climate is a collective challenge and a collective effort. And so there's an economic cost to not developing it, but there's also a potential environmental cost of developing it the wrong way. We believe, there's a lot of documentation out there to support that this is probably the most sustainable way to develop. Not developing at all is also sustainable, no question. But if it's going to get developed, at the very least, there are ways to do it. In fact, Scott White back here, that's one of his specialties. It's called light imprint, stormwater management, but we apply it to the site as a whole, and we reduce those ecological impacts by a significant degree. But you have to design with this level of care and sensitivity, or else it doesn't happen. And one of the things we took off of the earlier initial engineering studies was the stormwater retention ponds they were showing, because we don't want to do stormwater retention ponds. There's much more ecologically appropriate way to do that. So when we get to that level of detail, we will talk about how we can reduce all of those impacts. Also, these these are all also typically, and we did that on Carothers, we restored the degraded meadows that were degraded by the dairy farms that had been on that site. There weren't trees on it. There was mostly just sick grass, and that was a different project, but very similar to this. So I'm glad you mentioned sustainability, because it's pretty much in every single project we've ever done. So these are all natural waterways, but they're also wildlife corridors, and almost all the projects we work on, we work very hard to maintain not just those on our site, but the integrity of those corridors throughout the community as a whole. I'm sorry, anyway, thank you very much. We got another question right here? Yes.
My question is just, in the comp plan,
Yep.
it says the TND maxes out at 200 acres. So what do we do?
T&D max is out of 200 acres?
Yep, and we're just
Okay.
still planning process.
And is that,
It may be helpful if you repeat, because then people are watching online.
yep.
They can't hear.
Oh, I see. So the question was that the T&D section in the comp plan says and you say the T&D maxes out as a single community or... Okay. And that's being updated, is it not?
The one thing we're doing tonight and this week is a planning process. We haven't decided
Right. But it is important to note that this is consistent with the language that is in the comp plan. And by the way, and is that for the property as a whole or just the developable area?
That was, at the 2007 comprehensive plan, it was an overlay for the entire property at the time.
Gotcha, okay.
There's some differing language, slightly different language in how it's applied in LDO.
Gotcha.
But, you know, again, this is a planning process.
Exactly.
Not a determining factor on
Sure.
what it's going to be zoned.
I understand. So the point is that the point is taken, but this is, we're doing a visioning plan based on the application of those principles to a specific piece of property at this time. Yep. But thank you for pointing that out. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, the part that's green that you say can't be developed,
That's correct.
does that mean that all the trees are left? Or does that,
Yes, the intention and why it's not developed is because either it's steep slopes, which would be subject to erosion and then get into issues of water quality and so forth. So normally in those conditions, that would mean the existing vegetative materials would be undisturbed, but you can also go in and enhance those. And what I was starting to talk about, and I don't think we had Carothers up here, but we had some pictures from Carothers. There was literally, it was a dairy farm that had literally been run into the ground. And so we actually, part of our plan was to restore the original native meadows there. And that was part of the plan, which was, by the way, how many commissioners are there in Metro Nashville? 30, how many commissioners in Metro Nashville? Planning, yeah. Oh, no, I'm sorry, Metro, the council, sorry.
35 districts, 4 and 4.
Okay, and how many voted in approval of the entitlement of that property? Yes. My recollection was it was unanimous, and we created a code specific to that property, and the developer, our client, he got caught in a bad spot in 2008, too much outgo and not enough income yet. And this type of development tends to be much more capital intensive on the front end. And lost control of the property back to the bank. Every bottom feeder developer in the country, because it was fully entitled with infrastructure, wanted to buy that property and change the plan. And the county said, nope. This is what it was entitled at. This is its own zoning code, and that entitlement goes with this plan. Walton, a well-known developer of distressed properties, purchased the property with the expectation that they were going to be able to change the zoning on that, and they were unable to do it. And eventually, the property was purchased by a local developer who had already retrained himself to do this type of development, and it's now being developed exactly as it was originally planned, and all of those meadows are being restored as we speak. So, yep. Yes. Yes. It is, and it did not make the final cut because we were drawing really fast. It's in here. My understanding is it's not economically viable to restore, and of course we've heard that about a lot of things. I guess it's just a question of how motivated we think it could be potentially restored, or certainly restored and relocated. Yes. Yep. And there's actually one of the projects we used last night, Kentlands, actually was a farm that was redeveloped. And they have what they call the Old Farm District, or the Old Farm Neighborhood, which is the original manor house, all the outbuildings. The barn is a local performance venue for local live performances, local actors guild. And I think one of the stables is now a local branch office for the firm that designed the plan for that time. So yes, all of those things can be incorporated into the file. I'm getting an indication that we're out of time. Would you guys like to weigh in on these, or would you rather just wait until tomorrow night when we've had a chance to develop them? For- Yep. Yep. Well, I think if, at least if we got a general sentiment as to which plan everybody likes the most, and if there's something, a feature of them that they specifically like, I think, can they also respond online?
Yes, it's the exact same.
Okay, so I think maybe if you want, we can just go ahead and respond online if you prefer, if that's easier. Yes.
I just had a question. Looking around town
Yeah.
and the surrounding communities, there are 10 new developments being put up in and around Jamestown. And out of these developments, there's approximately almost 1,400 units. And out of the 1,400 units being built, only 150 are houses. The rest are townhomes and apartments. So wouldn't we want to kind of focus on building houses?
Well, everything we've showed you is houses. And our preference survey showed you exactly what we heard from the community as a whole. Every single one of those was a house. The only thing that wasn't a house that was documented was this. And that's a very, very small apartment building that looks like a house. So I think we've already responded to that. I mean, we've given the community an opportunity to weigh in, and the community has weighed in. And I think they're already saying what it sounds like you're about to say. So,
But I don't think it's necessary to build more townhouses and apartments when we got basically 12,
well, that's
50 being built around us.
right.
And, you know, a lot of people are desperate to buy houses and there's none out there right now. because the market's
That's true. And again, I'm pretty certain we'll have a lot of houses. And certainly to address that, to work to address that need. Yes. Yeah.
So now this is the planning phase, that looking forward, when is this expected to be completed?
Are you talking about the build out or the plan? Well, usually these have a relatively long build out period. And again, getting back to this idea of the neighborhood structure, this type of development lends itself much better to incremental phase development because it builds out in the skilled areas. By the way, that's how towns used to grow. I've got a map of the neighborhoods here in Jamestown, and that's exactly how they grew, one neighborhood at a time. So the phasing is a factor of a lot of things: infrastructure, market demand, sales velocity, and all of those things. But the nice thing about this, and a lot of these projects take 10 years to build out, but right from day one, you have a neighborhood with walkable streets. You have all of the attributes and characteristics that we've talked about right from day one in your first neighborhood. You don't have to wait for all those streets to be built and all of that. And it's not based on a pod, it's based on a neighborhood. So you're getting all of those characteristics and attributes right from day one, all the way through. Yes, yes, ma'am.
Really difficult time considering commercial on this property.
Yep.
When I think about what's happening at Publix and Landover Village, and how much more commercial construction is going to be there a 10th mile away.
Yeah.
Plus the parcel, the front parcel on the Center for Advanced Manufacturing.
Yep.
Right across the street.
Yep.
From Chick-fil-A.
Yep.
You love Chick-fil-A. But, you know, how many nail salons do we need?
Well, there's actually guys who make a living, guys and gals who make a living giving those numbers. But I will say this, talking about retail is like talking about mixed use. Everybody talks about it like it's a generic thing. It is not. It's an infinite spectrum of small, independently owned, locally owned shops up to big, huge mega stores. So when you say retail, you really need to be very specific. And so we have had some feedback from the community already that said they would like to see small, locally serving neighborhood retail commercial. So we're not sending Jamestown's residents to other towns and helping their tax base to buy things that they would like to be able to buy close to where they live. So that's a very different kind of retail, and we could probably figure out how to squeeze another Chick-fil-A in there if you'd like. But I'm just saying, what I'm trying to do is take this discussion to a higher level so that we're all being much more specific and precise, both about what we want and what we don't want, because that's the best way to get what you actually want. How are we doing on time? Okay, yes, one question.
You
And if there was broad representation. Sure, exactly, right.
But what are those legal and economic considerations that we need to understand so that we can possibly build consensus towards that? Or
Right, right. Again, it's probably above, I mean, I could certainly speak to that, but I'm not sure that it's appropriate for me to answer that question directly. But as a non-resident of Jamestown. But there's tax base, there's jobs, there's a whole range of potential issues. Plus, there is the implicit rights of the property owner, whatever they might be. And of course, that can all be debated, and it can be debated in a variety of different contexts, including in a court of law. So there's a range. Everything has consequences. Development has consequences, not developing has consequences, and the nature of how that process unfolds. So I just want to make sure that if that's a subject for discussion, that's being discussed fully on behalf of all of the residents in the community in an informed and accurate way. And I don't know if the town wants to take that on or they would like me to do it. But there are obviously very significant implications, and presumably the owner of the property has a significant investment in that property, would probably like to be, may have a say in that as well.
Yeah, I mentioned something that I mentioned last night. I know we have new people. And there's a few things that I wanted to share, and I think most of you probably heard a little bit last night. But one of the reasons that we hired Seth Harry and Associates was to be an independent person. He has no directions from the mayor or the town council or the staff on what it is that he's supposed to come up with. And what we are doing is using this process to gain a very compound, complex subject on a 467-acre property, but to come up with a design of what it is that we would like to see there that we think is in the best interest of our community. And based on this design that will come out of this, and certainly there's flexibility for putting things together, for mixing, for matching, and for going about it. But at the end of the process, if the public comes up with whatever they come up with and feel like it's in the best interest of the community, your mayor and your town council are not going to say, we don't like that, we like this. So we want him to be an independent contractor to represent the citizens in this process and to represent us. And the one thing that's going to be a lot different is that another person that we have hired is Tom Terrell. And Tom is probably one of the foremost land use attorneys. He's from High Point. He wrote a lot of the legislation at the state level. And so when we end up, what we will end up with is a negotiation between the town and the developers to see the things that we've come up with and the things that we would like to see. We will come up with an agreement that would hold the developer accountable for producing as much of what we come up with as possible. I'm sure there's going to be some give and take, but the purpose is to have the town get what we can support, build consensus for it. We have a foremost land use attorney to take this information and put it into an agreement with the developer. That would be agreed, and then that would be built. And I think this contrast with somebody putting something in our face and saying, this is what we'd like to see, we know you'll love it. Well, obviously that didn't work out. And we're thankful that we had Tom Terrell on our staff to assist us through that process. But Seth's group got here yesterday. They worked they got in. We had the session last night. They worked last night. They worked all day today. And as we go through this process, we start with very broad. We're looking at preferences, and then things are going to narrow down to where we come up with a smaller focus of something that we generally agree to. And we really, I don't think there's anybody else doing what we are doing. Even though we're a small town, I think we're a quality town. We don't mind paying for quality. We want quality. And Seth is pretty modest, but he is a nationally known person for urban design and planning, and his team from across the country has come into our town to assist us in this process, because sometimes you need folks to come in and help you when that's not been our experience on something that's the biggest thing that we will do in this town since 1752, when we were settled. So we want to do it once, we want to do it right, and we want to represent what the town has a feeling on.
Question for you.
Yes.
Were any lessons learned by yourself or the town council that were passed on to these gentlemen before?
Yes. Yes. I had the opportunity to look at all the meetings and the minutes, and I've been here since January, and I think the town council said, we want a better process, we want a better result, and we are investing in a national group to come in and assist us. There's some things that we don't want to repeat, and so we wanted to answer your question. Heck yes.
I've not heard anything you said that we learned a different process, much better process.
Well, that's,
I don't know if any of the likes or dislikes, pros and cons, some of the details
yes,
that, might be again discussed.
yeah.
But I'm telling you, whoever said yesterday that it looks like Diamondback revisited, I'm telling you, I was here for every Diamondback meeting, and I'm seeing much the same.
Well, I can assure you this is not the same.
I understand that, but at any rate, I don't think you're getting,
Well,
If there's a specific project that you are concerned that this is heading in that direction, I'm not familiar with Diamondback, but I'd be happy to look at it. And if you're correct, and it's heading in that direction, I want to know that. But I have a feeling that if I look at it, and if I analyze it critically based on how we would approach planning design of the application of these principles on this piece of land, I'm pretty confident we will not.
yeah.
But again, don't forget, we are literally 24 hours. before they want. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just saying, one of the challenges we always have is, and by the way, I've asked for examples of neighborhoods that you feel represent the things that you'd like to see, and ideally, some of these principles. And I'm familiar with some, but I'm always a little bit hesitant to offer local precedents, because oftentimes there's unknown associations that we aren't aware of. So one of the reasons we use projects that we are personally familiar with that are in other areas is that we don't get into discussions that aren't necessarily relevant to the actual physical planning and design, because they may have, the issues may be, or the feelings about those neighborhoods may have nothing to do with that. But if there's something that you think like that this project could, in your mind, is heading down that road, tell me what it is. I will go look at it, and if I agree with you, I will say, okay, here's an example of a project that this gentleman doesn't want to see. But I suspect that what we have in mind, and by the end of the week, we will be there, it won't look anything like that. Okay. But we won't know if we don't get to the end of the week. Again, it's a process. And the reason why we do this, 3 or 4 times before we're all done, is so that we're all on the same page. So when you say Diamondback, I say, I looked at Diamondback, and that's not where we're going to end up. So it's okay. But, I understand your concern. It's a legitimate concern. I'd be happy to look at it if you'd like me to look at it.
Maybe you could look at the packet that they, presented, or, the red. I think it's a lot of
Which,
the packet that of the last presentation, the Diamondback plan.
oh,
Just because I feel like
was it Diamondback? Was it called Diamondback? I thought it was something else.
Oh, yes. I have seen it. We're not going to end up there, trust me. We want to give you the best possible plan that we think you can have. And if you say, draw this, we will draw it. I may not believe that it's the best possible plan for the town based on a larger set of issues. But if you insist, we'll draw it. But what I'm trying to do is take advantage of this process to give you the tools to express what you would like to see in a more precise and accurate way. So you don't just say mixed use, you don't just say retail, you describe exactly the kind of mixed use and exactly the kind of retail you're talking about. Because retail comes in every shade of the rainbow, every size, every color, every type. And so when people say retail to me, it means a very, very, very different thing than when somebody might talk about retail in a generic way. And we're trying to be very, very precise because this is your community and we want to make sure we get it right. So the more able we are to say exactly what we mean, the better we're able to accommodate that request.
When do we get to see the final plan?
On Saturday afternoon. But we've still got lots of things to do. We've got another pinup tomorrow night, and we'll be better prepared tomorrow night because we've got some of the bugs out of the system. And there's also going to be an open studio on Thursday. So if you want to come in and actually see all of your ideas being drawn, you're welcome to come in and look over our shoulders while we're doing it. But by then, we'll be several steps, several generations beyond where we are right now. It's Thursday, I think, from like 1 to 2, something like that, 1 to 2 or 3. Okay, yeah, and there you go. That's why we have Anna here, and she's leaving tomorrow, but we'll have Matt after that. But anyway, thank you all for coming. Yes, absolutely.